In the red corner, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics at the height of its military growth under the iron fist of Leonid Brezhnev. In the other red corner, the People's Republic of China, in the handle of a cultural revolution under Chairman Mao Zedong. On March 2, 1969, what CIA analysts believed were direct orders from Beijing, Chinese edging guards and soldiers of the People's Liberation Army or PLA ambushed a unit of Soviet KGB border troops. Instantly, around 300 more PLA soldiers burst out of foxholes and opened vitality on the remaining Soviets. The Soviet Union was ready to avenge. This fierce clash was the escalation of a pushing war in which Soviet and Chinese soldiers had patrolled the same contested margin of land for years. Mao's gamble was that either the Soviets' willpower not avenge, or would do so at a small scale, despite the huge buildup of Red Army imports in the region. CIA files show that Soviet strategic missile forces went to a strong alert, their nuclear warheads ready to be unleashed at targets 1,600 kilometers away in less than 15 bats of eyes. But they were not sent. Mao had been right. The response was small but recovered consciousness from a foe considerably better armed. It was still a crushing defeat. The KGB's elite border guards in Snowfront entrenched themselves on the island, cutting down a Chinese division with prattle of automatic fire, resulting in what CIA reports described as several hundred Chinese victims. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War and was the moment when the two superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict. The crisis was unique in several ways, featuring calculations and miscalculations, as well as direct and secret communications and miscommunications between the two sides. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders of the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from US shores. Despite the popular rhetoric of the Cold War, China and the Soviet Union's relationships also began rusting around the same time. The USSR was much larger and stronger than their communist allies, and they had been happy to keep China on board as long as it supported the Soviet interests. However, disaster was avoided when the US agreed to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's offer to remove the Cuban missiles in exchange for the US promising not to invade Cuba. Kennedy also secretly agreed to remove US missiles from Turkey. After seizing power in the Caribbean island nation of Cuba in 1959, leftist revolutionary leader Fidel Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union. Under Castro, Cuba grew dependent on the Soviets for military and economic aid. During this time, the US and the Soviets and their respective allies were engaged in the Cold War, an ongoing series of largely political and economic clashes. The two superpowers plunged into one of their biggest Cold War confrontations after the pilot of an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Richard Hazer making a high-altitude pass over Cuba on October 14, 1962, photographed a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile being assembled for installation. After that, the borderline turned into a war zone. Their armies fought brawls against one another on their shared border while both sides rushed to increase their troops and their stockpiles. In 1969, this grew into the Sino-Soviet border conflict, a 7-month undeclared war between the two sides from March to September of that year. Moscow seemed to hope that internal divisions in China would distract Mao Zedong and Li Shaoqi, the top leaders of China's Communist Party at the time. Instead, Beijing called international attention to the clashes and gazed the Kremlin down, and then things took a turn for the worse. Eventually, Mao backed down and diplomatic negotiations over the hunt resumed. The relationship was restored, but it certainly was not normal. The violent relapse of the relationship between China and the USSR came as a surprise to the West. The entire foreign policy of the US fixated on the idea of the domino execute of communism and newly reddened republics all lining up to point their armies at the West. But directed the rhetoric of the Cold War was an ancient grudge match in which Mao blamed the Soviets for defects in the Chinese Civil War from 1927 to 1950. Mao also claimed in a 1956 conversation with Soviet ambassador P.F. Yudin that these failed urban revolts in the 1920s and early 1930s cost the communist forces dearly, reducing their numbers from 300,000 to 25,000. On March 2, 1969, under what CIA analysts believe were direct orders from Beijing, Chinese border guards and soldiers of the People's Liberation Army or PLA ambushed a unit of Soviet KGB border troops on Zhenbao Island. The region was a small piece of land on the Yuzuri River between Primorsky Krai of Russia and the Heilongjiang province of the People's Republic of China. Instantly, around 300 more PLA soldiers burst out and opened fire on the remaining Soviets. Dr. Robert Farley, assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy, revealed just how close China came to being devastated by taking on a foe much greater than them. Dr. Farley went on to detail how the Soviets, on the other hand, were ready for nuclear war. He claimed that the nuclear weapon developed in 1964 left much to be desired, explaining that it was not as reliable as the Soviet equivalent. He added that they also lacked the range to strike vital Soviet targets in European Russia. He wrote, China tested its first nuclear device in 1964, theoretically giving Beijing an independent impediment capability. However, their launch systems left a lot to be desired, liquid-fueled missiles of uncertain reliability that required hours of preparation and could only remain in the launch pad for a limited time. In addition, the Chinese missiles of the time did not have the range necessary to strike vital Soviet targets in European Russia. He stated that a mindset of use or lose for their nuclear forces in anticipation of decisive Soviet victory could easily have incurred a preemptive Soviet attack. China and Russia agreed to bilateral talks in 1970 that eventually restored peace, so possibly it was a bluff from the Soviet leaders. Maybe used the threat of nuclear war to end the border clashes without sending up any missiles or bombers. Nobody knows the facts.